Hey guys, in today's video, we'll go over how to frame and install a whiteboard panel that expands across two or more openings. As a reminder, when framing for our Flex series, the vertical flex studs are always installed first. If you have a situation where you have a whiteboard that is greater than 48 inches wide, you're going to send flex studs specifically cut out to allow the whiteboard to bypass the flex stud or studs in the center of the opening and allow the whiteboard to expand across multiple openings. When you receive the materials and you have flex studs that are cut out, you'll need to make sure to use those where the whiteboards are located. Here's the flex stud specifically cut out for the whiteboards. Basically, all we do is we rip the trim channel off the center of the stud to create a flush surface to allow the whiteboard to bypass the flex studs. To determine the location of the cutout, we will take a look at the drawing to see where the bottom of the panel begins. From there, we'll rip about a 50-inch section of the stud to allow the panel to rest against the flex stud. This means when you go to cut the flex stud for height, you need to cut the top only. So it is important that you determine which side of the stud is the bottom before cutting the stud. Now in this case, there's only one side ripped to the flex stud, therefore we'll have a full height panel on the opposite side. If you have a flex stud that's ripped on both sides, that means you're going to have a whiteboard on both sides of the stud. You'll just need to take a look at the drawing to determine where those flex studs need to be used. The whiteboards come in multiple different sizes depending on what the project calls for. To determine the approximate size of the whiteboard, take a look at your drawing. There will be situations where you do not need to cut down the whiteboard at all. And the situations where you need to cut the whiteboards, you can use a circular saw to do so. Once you have the overall width of the whiteboard determined, we can then set the stud spacing between the non-modified flex studs on each end of the whiteboard. To set the stud spacing, take the overall width of the whiteboard and add 1/8 of an inch. Then take this measurement and measure from the inside point of the flex stud over to the same point on the opposite side flex stud. Adding the 1/8 of an inch will give you room to install the whiteboard. Once you have the stud spacing set, tighten the set screws and the L brackets to lock the studs in place. Once the bottom of the studs have been established, move up to the top and repeat the same process. With the vertical flex studs on each end of the whiteboard spaced properly, I can now install the modified flex stud. You'll need to take a look at your drawing to determine the approximate spacing for the modified stud as well as the quantity needed. In this case, I will only be using one modified stud, therefore I'll be centering it in between my two studs on each end of the whiteboard. Once you have the modified stud in place, make sure to tighten the set screws in the floor and ceiling track to lock the stud in place. With the vertical studs installed, we can now run our horizontal studs. Cut the horizontal studs so they fit in between the vertical studs. Make sure to include 2 flex L brackets per horizontal stud. You'll need a horizontal stud at the bottom and the top unless the top of the whiteboard is going up into the ceiling track. To determine the height of the horizontal stud, you can use the cutout on the vertical stud as a reference point. As mentioned earlier, we determine the cutout location based on the drawing. Therefore, we can set the horizontal stud near the location of where the cutout begins. One thing we need to make sure of is that the trim channel on the vertical stud does not interfere with the trim channel on the horizontal stud. The reason being is because the flex trim is going to extend across the entire bottom of the whiteboard. Once you have this side of the horizontal stud attached, you can then use a torpedo level to level the horizontal stud and attach it to the stud on that end of the opening. Once you have this stud established, you can then attach your other horizontal stud using the screws coming through the flex stud. Once you have the horizontal studs established, we can then measure for our horizontal stud at the top of the opening. To determine the spacing between the horizontal studs, take the height of the whiteboard and add 1/8 of an inch. Then take that measurement and measure from this point on the horizontal flex stud at the bottom to the same point as the horizontal stud at the top of the opening. Once you've placed this flex stud, anchor it to the vertical stud, use your level to level the stud, and then repeat the same process for the remaining horizontal studs at the top of the opening. Again, same as the bottom part of the opening, we want to make sure that the trim channel for the vertical flex stud does not interfere with the horizontal trim channel. As you can see, this trim channel continues from this part of the opening onto this side of the opening. This will allow the flex trim to run all the way across the top of the whiteboard. With the opening for the whiteboard frame, we can now go ahead and install our whiteboard. To install the whiteboard, place the whiteboard onto the horizontal studs at the bottom of the opening. Then press the whiteboard against the vertical and horizontal studs around the opening. Once in place, take trim tags to temporarily secure the whiteboard until the remaining panels are installed. Once the whiteboard is installed, there'll be a tight fit between the vertical studs on each end, as well as a small gap between the top of the whiteboard and the horizontal flex studs. We'll now go over how to install flex trim when you have a whiteboard running across multiple openings. Before installing the flex trim, make sure all of the panels are installed on the wall. We'll start by measuring and installing the vertical trim at each vertical stud location except for the vertical studs beneath and above the whiteboard. Once we have the vertical trim installed, we can then measure for the horizontal trim at the bottom and top of the whiteboard. Once the horizontal trim is installed, we can then install the vertical trim below and above the whiteboard. If you have any questions on how to measure for the flex trim, check out the video on installing the trim. So I'll go ahead and install the flex trim surrounding the whiteboard. With the flex trim installed, the installation is complete. This will conclude the video. If you have any questions, please contact our office.